tells us there was an angel in the tomb and that the panic-stricken guards had fled. Realizing that Jesus' body was no longer in the tomb and terrified what Pilate would do if he found out, the chief priest's men bribed the guards to say nothing.
You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.
So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed. And this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day.
The great stone that the angel rolled open and sat on, as told in Mark 16:4. Later, the Gospel of Matthew tells us the two Marys went to the tomb to anoint the body of Jesus. When they arrived at the tomb, they saw an angel roll the stone open and sit on it.
After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it.
Here, you can literally walk through the Bible. Check the width and the height of the great stone, so when you go back to Jerusalem and visit the most popular Christian site in the world, the Garden Tomb, then look at the channel where the stone was and you will see it fits there like a glove. The great stone only fits one tomb in the world, the Garden Tomb. Go into the most famous tomb in the world built by Joseph of Arimathaea and see where he laid Jesus.
As you can see, the door into the tomb is quite small, but the tomb itself roomy, about 14.5 feet by 10 and 7.5 feet high, which is quite high considering that few men stood more than 6 feet tall. The entrance would be made intentionally small to deter grave robbers. To the front, we see the weeping chamber. The mourners would be women. On the right, here, a low wall hewn from the rock divides the room. Below, a pillow has been cut out of the rock, and beyond, an unfinished tomb, perhaps intended for Joseph of Arimathea's wife.
While you are there, put your fingers in the most famous split rock in the world, as in Matthew 27:51.
The Bible speaks of an earthquake at the moment of Jesus' death, and Simon can be seen pointing at a large split in the rock.
But the Bible also says there was a violent earthquake, and interestingly enough, there is a large earthquake crack here in the rock face. Can you see that? Which could, of course, be evidence of that very earthquake.
The tomb is large enough to accommodate not only Peter and John, but also the two angels Mary Magdalene saw in the tomb.
Then touch the most famous seal in the world, as in Matthew 27:65.
To the left hand of the entrance, there is evidence that a metal spike was driven into the rock at a height of 71 inches. There was probably another spike on the other side, but that since disappeared. Critics claim that this is not evidence of a metal spike at all, but remnants of shrapnel from battles of the last century. However, tests have shown the metal is ancient.
Walk just around the corner to see where the Romans led Jesus to crucify him, and you will see the feature of the skull as mentioned in the Book of Mathew.
The excavation took almost half a century, but in the end, the site was very much as we see it today. From time immemorial, it had been called Skull Hill, and Golgotha is Aramaic for the place of the skull. If we look at the site from here, we can clearly see the shape of the eye sockets and the nose. Gordon was sure that this was the correct site because St. John tells us that at the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been buried.
And on your way out, don't forget to look at the winepress and the water well, which must have belonged to a rich man such as Joseph of Arimathaea.
Now we come to investigate the area outside the tomb. There is a large cistern which confirms that it was almost certainly a garden in Jesus' time. The dry climate meant saving water for irrigation in underground containers in the rock. This cistern holds 250,000 gallons of water, the third largest in Jerusalem, and it must have been used to irrigate a large and luxuriant garden.
If I could remind you of a verse in John's Gospel, do you remember? It says in John's Gospel that at the place where Jesus was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now we've seen the possible site of the crucifixion at that place called Skull Hill. Here we are in a beautiful garden, but what's the evidence to say there was a garden here at the time of Jesus? If you look at this photograph, I think this shows you part of the evidence that tells us there was a garden here at that time. This is a very large water cistern. As you know, they dug them all over Israel in the past, didn't they, to store the rainwater in the winter so they had plenty of water for the dry season. This one, the head of it, is just over there and it goes deep underground. It's the third largest water cistern in Jerusalem and it takes about 1 million litres of water, and it's been dated back to pre-Christian times, so it's over 2,000 years old. So it was certainly here at the time of Jesus. Now the discovery of this cistern and also an ancient wine press that's been found here tell us this was a garden at that time, not the sort of garden that you're looking at now, but we believe it was a cultivated area, and we think it was probably a vineyard for growing grapes with lots of water in this to water those grapes. Now because it's so extensive, it also suggests that it's a garden of a rich man like Joseph of Arimathea. We know he was wealthy, don't we? The Bible tells us. And if you remember, he and Nicodemus, they'd both become secret followers of Jesus, hadn't they? But in the end, they had the courage to come out in the open, and they went to Pilate, the Roman governor, asked for his body, and the Bible says they buried him in Joseph's own new tomb. So all the three things described in John's Gospel are found here on this site. So you can see how well it does fit the biblical account.
Just such a garden as would belong to a wealthy merchant like Joseph of Arimathea. Yards away, we have a wine press, which must have been used for the garden's fruit. It was there before Jesus' burial and is one of the largest ever found in Israel. The cistern and the winepress are circumstantial evidence.
These things were all written down in the 4 Gospels nearly 2,000 years ago. When you return home from seeing these treasures, order our free film, The Evidence and the True Face of the Shroud. And you will see concrete physical evidence for us to look to in order to discover the true face of Jesus. The crucifixion is the most significant event in the history of man, when God's Son Jesus Christ died so that we may be saved. Since that day, people have struggled to prove to themselves and others that the events described in the Bible really happened. Yet there remains only one real piece of concrete physical evidence for us to look to in order to discover the true face of Jesus. This is the shroud of Turin, the burial cloth of Jesus. We believe God chose one of his own people, a Jew, Barry Schwartz, to become the greatest expert on the shroud of Turin and prove not just to the world, but his own people, the Jews, that this cloth with a 3D image of a man was not created by any artistic means currently known to mankind. And that it is impossible to create this 3D image, showing that Jesus was indeed crucified and resurrected.
As I see the scars of the nails in his hands, and put my finger on those scars, and my hand in his side, I will not believe.
The world is full of doubting Thomases, people who need to see with their own eyes the physical proof of things that others are willing to believe on faith alone. Seek and ye shall find, said Jesus. And it was in the spirit that the Shroud of Turin research project set out in 1978 to try to uncover the truth about the shroud. Dozens of the world's best scientists from the Los Alamos National Scientific Laboratories in the US, Air Force Academy and NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab, amongst others, converged on Turin, where they spent 120 hours running over 1,000 tests and taking over 30,000 photographs of the cloth in which Jesus was buried. Amongst them was expert photographer Barry Schwartz.
Of course, I founded Shroud.com 12 years ago in 1996, and that website has grown to become the largest and the oldest and probably the most relevant website on the Shroud of Turin on the entire internet. And the reason for that simply is that I have no bias from a Christian or non-Christian point of view. I can stick to the science, I can stick to the facts.
Barry Schwartz, like many of the scientists on the Shroud research team, was a skeptic. He was in Turin as a professional just doing his job. But what the team found when they got there was to change their lives forever.
Now remember that there were hundreds of tests taken in '78 that indicated the shroud was not a painting, was not a photograph, it was not the kind of thing that one would expect to be a manufactured relic. And a wealth of other evidence gathered by our team and others indicated that the shroud was not a fake, that it was not a medieval painting, forgery, hoax, photograph, rubbing, etching, dust painting. These are all things that have been basically used to try and describe the shroud and what it might have been.
So the first thing that the scientists found, much to their surprise and delight, was that the shroud was not a fake. At least insofar as it was not created by any artistic means currently known to mankind. All of the research team's tests indicated that this was a genuine burial cloth. But then how could they be sure that it was actually the shroud of Jesus Christ and nobody else?
Obviously, the most important thing on the Shroud of Turin is the image of a man, front and back, ventral and dorsal, that appears along the full length of the cloth, with the ventral and dorsal images head to head with an appropriate space between them for the cloth to have been wrapped the way it was. Of course, the most important thing that we see, if we look at the ventral image, front image, is the man himself. And as he stands there, you can see his arms crossed before him. You can see his shoulders, although they were damaged in the fire of 1532 and there are holes and patches there now. You can then see the legs, the knees, the thighs, the calves, and even the feet on the ventral image. Now, when you look at the shroud a little closer,